I'm Samuel Zwickel.
I'm Andrew Liang.
And we're roommates at Harvard. Andrew, hurry up!
Sam, get out of here!
Right now, we don't amount to much.
So we decided to see what interesting things other pairs of friends have done since leaving Cambridge.
Turns out some Crimson editors teamed up to help a president win re-election.
Other friends run multi-billion-dollar hedge funds together.
So join us as we chat with these people who are much cooler than we are.
And this is
Crimson Connections. Yeah, wonderful. So I guess just to start off, we'd love to hear about your first impressions of each other. How did you meet, and what was that experience like?
We have slightly different views of this. I think we've been asked this question before. Walter's memory, and you, Walter, you should jump in here, is that we met each other in college, which I don't remember. But what I remember is Walter walking into my office at Time Magazine and instantly thinking, wow, this guy's impressive. I want to get to know him. Just sort of an instantaneous reaction. And we became good friends fast there. But Walter, what do you remember?
Well, both sides of that I don't remember, in the sense that I don't know if Andrew, y'all are both the same class.
We are.
Yeah. Evan was a year ahead of me. This means I knew Evan, but Evan paid zero attention to people who are a year younger. I was in the Lampoon, which I don't know if y'all know what that is. It's a humor magazine on Zero Freedom Square.
I've heard of it.
There were a lot of friends of mine in the Lampoon who were part of the same social circle as Evan. So I'd go there, and I knew a guy named Bruns Grayson pretty well. And I got to know who Evan was, but until he went to Time Magazine, he refused to remember my name. And then all of a sudden we were friends.
That must be it. One was Harvard was super different from today in the sense that a lot of students did not work very hard. I think you guys work hard. My daughters went to Harvard, so they worked pretty hard. And I did embarrassingly little academic work at Harvard. The only exception would be my thesis, which I took seriously. The rest of it was a joke. I didn't go to class. I'd gone to a good boarding school, so I didn't really need to study. And that was quite typical. And I'm not bragging about this. I'm ashamed of this. We squandered our educations. Our educations were outside of the classroom. Now there I did learn some things, and I learned some of it at the Crimson. I was an unusual thing at the Crimson. I was a preppy. There weren't too many preppies, and I wanted to join a final club. Very unusual that. The Crimson hated the clubs, but the Crimson never wrote about the clubs. They hated them, but they didn't write about them. I mean, ever. But I heard the last week of Punching that there had been a wild party at the Owl where they had trashed the Myopia Hunt Club. They had thrown, there's a bowling alley at the Myopia Hunt Club, and they throw bowling, whatever you call those things, bowling pins and broken windows, and urinated in the bus. So I wrote a piece about it for the Crimson. And I wasn't all that conscious of how meaningful this was, but a delegation of angry seniors from the Porcelain Club marched down to the Crimson and denounced me for breaking this kind of rule. It was a stupid rule. I mean, why was it even a rule? But, how dare I write about the clubs? Well, come on. But, I didn't know. I was a sophomore. I didn't know anybody, but I learned something, which was I inadvertently stumbled into something. I sort of figured out a little bit about who I was. That, maybe I did want to be a journalist, because fuck the Porcelain Club. We were going to write this piece, and the Crimson printed it, and it was called, the headline, you can look it up, Bowling and Brawling with the Owls. It was on the front page. Now, I'm a hypocrite. I joined a final club. I joined the Fly Club. So, which was, it did not endear me to my fellow Crimson editors. So I'm a complete hypocrite about this. Having exposed one of these institutions, I proceeded to join it. But I learned something in the process about which side of the fence I was on. And that was a kind of a useful training for me, that you got to be prepared to be hated by everybody if you want to be a journalist. I didn't do this as a martyrish. I didn't even know that was going to be the impact. I would get hurt feelings when people got mad at me. for writing about this stuff, it would hurt my feelings. And I would kind of regret it. Jesus, maybe I shouldn't have written that. But I was learning something in the process of doing this. So the Crimson, I've always been grateful to the Crimson for that particular education. That's the end of my long story.
Well, I came from down here in New Orleans, and I had never lived up north or hardly been up north. So what I really learned, was getting out of my bubble down here. I drove up with a group of friends. I had a Pontiac, and sorry about all the noise here. And what I learned, like Evan, was you weren't going to learn things in class so much. You were going to learn it by people around you. So I joined the Lampoon, joined things. My daughter went to Harvard a few years ago. So one thing I told her is that you spend a lot of time getting A's. I said, I don't want you to get A's now. I want you to join organizations. I loved Harvard. I mean, I just had the best of times. But I got through with only one professor at the entire place knowing my name, and he didn't like me. He ended up dating somebody that I was trying to go out with, Alan Heimert. He's no longer with us, so I can reveal his name. But it was sort of a nice life's education.
So you're in college and doing all of these things, and when did you sort of figure out, what you wanted to do first after graduation, and what was that? Did you know you wanted to become a journalist or an author, or were you trying to figure things out still by senior year?
When I was at Harvard, I had no clue what I was going to do. But I had worked one summer for the newspaper, the Times-Picayune down here, and I'd written about sugarcane workers. And this very young editor, somebody just died a few weeks ago, named Harry Evans, for some reason came wandering through Harvard to give some talks. And I decided that I would apply for a job at the Sunday Times of London. Now, so I gathered all these clips I did about sugarcane workers and mailed them. It was days before email, off to London, and I forgot all about it. About 4 months later, I got a telegram. Now, I'm not sure any of you remember what telegrams were, but I was in the courtyard of Lowell House, which is where I live, and there's a Western Union telegram dude dropping off a telegram. And it just said, "We'll hire on limited basis Harry Evans." And I had to try to remember what that was all about. And finally, because you couldn't telephone or email, it was hard to sort this all out, he was offering me a job. So I flew off to London and worked for the Sunday Times of London for a while and stayed there as long as I could until I finally, because I didn't have a National Union of Journalists card, had to come back to America. In the meantime, I had gone to Oxford and studied philosophy. The world then, as now, did not need more philosophers. There weren't big philosophy firms you could apply to for a job. So I decided maybe I should become an academic philosopher. There were two great philosophers at Harvard who had taught, whose classes I had taken, John Rawls and Robert Nozick. John Rawls being very much a communitarian, a little bit like Michael Sandel, taught the justice course, and Nozick was a libertarian, and they were competing ideologies, but great professors worked together. And I sent my thesis from Oxford, which was on John Locke, basically. And I said I was trying to decide whether to become a journalist or a academic, a philosopher. And both of them read the thesis, and both of them independently, although they very rarely agreed on anything, both of them agreed that I should become a journalist. And so I did.
I went to law school really to make money. I wanted to make money. So that's why I went to law school, was because I didn't want to live, journalists made no money, and I wanted to live live in Long Island and be rich or comfortable. But when I was in law school, I found my wife. The good news about law school is I got married to my wife of 50 years, who's just walked by. But I didn't really learn to love the law. So I graduated from law school and then realized actually I did want to be a journalist after all. So that was a little awkward because I was unemployed for a while, but I got hired by Time Magazine after about 4 or 5 months of unemployment. And that was, set a course for me that I spent 33 years in news magazines at Time and Newsweek and wrote books and, and had a fantastic career, which I am hugely grateful for. Back in the days when Time and Newsweek were rich, they could afford to throw a lot of people at a story. And so they're very collaborative, and this can be frustrating, of course, but it can also be wonderful because you learn to work with others, correspondents, editors, writers. I mean, you look at they put in bylines when we were there. Sometimes these stories would have 8 bylines. And so that's part of it. News magazines were overstaffed, and in a way they are not today. And there's no internet. So we're only coming out once a week. You're really only doing 1 story a week. You're not doing 5 a day, you're doing 1 a week. So that meant that there was a lot of free time to hang around and drink bourbon and smoke cigarettes and talk to your new friend, Walter Isaacson. So we spent a lot of time getting to know each other that way. And then Walter had this idea of doing a book together. Walter, why don't you tell that story?
Well, what happened was, as Evan said, you only had to write 1 story a week. So you had 5 or 6 days to do diddly squat, and it was kind of boring. And then when you wrote the story, they wanted to cut it down to 1 page so that, you didn't really get to put much in it. And we were generally frustrated. And I had never quite known that you could write books, although my mentor down here was a novelist, a guy named Walker Percy, who probably not that well known now, but was a great novelist in the 1970s and 80s down here. And so I had learned from him this concept that, wow, if you want to, I thought you had to be a doctor, an engineer, a fisherman, or an oil rig person. I didn't realize you could be a writer of books for a living. And it was also because, as Evan said, you didn't really have bylines. Nobody knew who you were. You were working anonymously for these news magazines. So the concept of writing a book seemed really cool. So I just remember going into my old friend, Evan Thomas's office. He had an office like 1 or 2 doors from me. We were sort of in glorified cubicles. And we'd kick around the idea of writing a book. And I think we were spending time in a summer cottage in Sag Harbor, New York, right, Evan? Do I remember this correctly?
And right. Walter rented the cheapest house available to struggling young writers in Sag Harbor called the Mouse House, mostly because it was full of figurines and mouses, I think, the renter. I can't remember exactly why. Anyways, it was the Mouse House. It was a dump. But that's where we got together to cook up this book idea.
And so Evan and I were trying to figure out what type of book to write. I was covering Ronald Reagan's campaign for Time. And every time I'd get to some big rally, people would be handing out, because they were paranoid back then, about this conspiracy of the Bilderberg Group and the Rockefellers and the Trilateral Commission and all these people taking over the world. Evan was the only preppy I knew. So I said, okay, Evan, what's this thing about the American establishment? And we used to be talking about maybe we should do a book on the establishment in America. And we spent, I think, 4 or 5 days out in Sag Harbor. I used to work very late at night because I'm a night person. Evan gets up early. So one night, I think, and I may be romanticizing this, I stayed up till about 4 or 5 in the morning, and Evan got up early. And by the end of the night, I had done, and then Evan had taken over a chart of 6 friends who were really at the heart of the establishment. The 6 wise men were Abel Harriman, Dean Acheson, Bob Lovett, John McCloy, Bolin, and George Kennan. And they fit together somewhat nicely. There were 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. 2 of them were lawyers, 2 of them were bankers, 2 of them were diplomats. They tended, I think, all to be at Harvard, Yale, Princeton during their time. I guess McCloy went to Amherst, but sort of got connected in.
Harvard Law School.
Yeah, so he gets connected in when he goes to law school. then they all sort of a part of a Wall Street clique of Brown Brothers, Harriman, merging their interests. McCloy becomes a lawyer for it. So we watch them weave together. And Alice Mayhew, this legendary editor who died earlier this year, she would write in the margin "Atigta," which meant all things in good time. She made sure we kept a chronological narrative. And back then, chronological narratives were out of favor at universities. It was considered imposing a narrative on history. But so we wrote a book called The Wise Men about how the Cold War order was made.
I mean, the conceited or the conceit of the subtitle was Six Friends in the World They Made. The world they made sounds a bit over the top, but it's a true point. One of the wise men, Averell Harriman, said that after World War II, most Americans, they'd won World War II. They wanted to just come home, go to the movies, and drink Coke. But there's a small group that said, no, we can't. Great Britain is declining as a global empire. The Russians are coming on strong. Somebody has to step into the void here. That somebody is the United States. It's our time. As Henry Luce said, the American century. And they got together, and although they weren't well known to the public, they really had this cause of what later became known as globalism. I mean, the idea that America has this central role to play in the world through economic relationships, but also military alliances. And they created the Western Alliance and the Marshall Plan, these sort of foundation stones of America saving Europe, basically. And the post-war global order, which still exists today, despite Donald Trump, those guys were seminal in creating. I mean, obviously Harry Truman and General Marshall and all that get the credit, but these were the guys in the engine room really making this work.
By the way, you've just learned something, which is when you ask two alumni to tell you something in 30 seconds, you ain't going to get it in 30 seconds.
Sorry.
To follow up on that, how do you choose who to write about? Do you have like a list in your head of these are the 10 people that I would write about if given the chance to just tick them off, or do you look at current events?
And so once we finished that book, I wanted to then follow up with a book about Vietnam. And to me, the best way to do it was through Henry Kissinger, because he was reviled by some and loved by some, and you could help explain us extricating ourselves in the Vietnam War through Kissinger. After I did Kissinger, I said, man, I want to do somebody who's been dead for 200 years, because he was such a pain in the ass to deal with. And so having ended the Kissinger book with the notion of realism in American foreign policy, I had studied a bit about the only other great realist in American foreign policy, which was Benjamin Franklin, who was able to do a balance of power game during the Revolution. And most people who had written about Benjamin Franklin write about him as sort of a literary figure. And I wanted to do him as a scientist, a diplomat, and everything else. So that was great. And once I realized what a great scientist he was, I decided I wanted to demystify science for our generation, which had been made too complex by Einstein. So I wanted to show that Einstein was understandable. And after I did Franklin and Einstein, I got a call from Steve Jobs who said, do me next. And I went, yeah, Ben Franklin, Albert Einstein, you arrogant little prick. I'll wait until you've retired. But then somebody said, if you're going to do Steve, you got to do him now. I hadn't realized he had been diagnosed with cancer because he was keeping it secret, but then he told me. So it's sometimes one thing leads to another. I told him I wanted to write about him. He said, well, Walter, I'm not sure that you ever understand the depths of my knowledge of foreign policy. So I just began writing a book about him. And I didn't ask his permission. Then after I had been interviewing people who knew him and was clearly writing this book, I started getting phone calls from Henry Kissinger. I mean, after all, it's a topic in the world that most interests him. So he was definitely going to play ball with this. And after a while, it wasn't a question of getting interviews from Kissinger. It was like, all right, we've now had 42 breakfasts or something. That's enough. With Steve Jobs, it was the most interesting because he pursued me and then said he wanted no control and he didn't even want to read the book before it came out. And if there's one thing I don't understand about Steve Jobs, because he was such a control freak, I've never fully understood why he just wanted me to write a book and for him to have no control over it, but it was fine.
I've had mixed experiences on this. I wrote a biography of Bobby Kennedy. Dealing with the Kennedy family is a living nightmare. On the one hand, they're the greatest publicity hounds in the history of the universe. On the other hand, they totally want to control everything. And I had to jump through more goddamn hoops I mean, they had a secret committee involved in giving me access to papers that should have been public anyways. I mean, the stories just go on and on. That made me feel like Walter. I didn't want to do, my next book was definitely going to be about a dead person who lived 2 centuries before. I wrote a book about John Paul Jones just to get as far away from the Kennedys as I possibly could. Then I had a better experience, kind of more interesting experience with Sandra Day O'Connor, my most recent book. Justice O'Connor was thinking about writing her own memoir, kind of, but really her publisher, Random House, was more thinking about it because they wanted to make some money on it. And she was ambivalent. She got Alzheimer's and the family didn't know what to do. I had been brought in maybe as a ghostwriter, maybe sort of, but I could tell she didn't want to do it. And then they came to me and said, all right, we'll do a biography. And I said, you know, I have to have complete access to all of her papers. There's a big issues about, you know, access. And that was tricky because her papers were closed. And not only that, but her official papers, her Supreme Court papers, had the papers of a lot of other Supreme Court justices in them. So I had to go through all sorts of convoluted processes to get that sorted out. And then there's the issue about, you know, people say the book's an authorized biography. It's not. Authorized biography means that the family can control it. And I made it very clear that you can't control this. This is in your own interest. If it's known that you controlled it, nobody's going to believe it. You know, it's by definition an in-house job. And so I have to be able to say, and it has to be true, that you had no control over it. And having said that, I showed the sons, she had 3 sons, chunks of the book as I was writing it. And, you know, they objected to things, but that was a good process because I made it clear they couldn't control it, but I wanted to hear what they had to say. You know, you make mistakes, they catch, but you start a conversation going. And my experience with this, the long experience, is if you keep this conversation going, you learn more and you learn more. And initially they can be standoffish, but over time you get a dialogue going. And once they start to trust you, you learn more and more and more. And I had this experience as a journalist as well. Journalists are not supposed to show their stuff before they publish it to their sources. That's probably a rule to Crimson. I broke that rule all the time at Newsweek when I was doing controversial stories, because one thing, they do catch small errors, but also you get them, they trust you a little bit more, you get a dialogue going. And I didn't do this on a routine deadline story, but if I was doing a long story over a period of time that involved controversy, I would tell them, hey, I'm about to write this about you. And they would react and you get into an argument about it. And, you know, but that was good because you learned and you couldn't get rolled by it. That can be tricky because, you know, it's a complicated human relationship you got going here. But in the long run, over a long story, I thought it was useful. You don't have to read it to them, but you certainly have to tell them what it is you're writing about so they can respond. And because they will be more responsive. They will tell you stuff that they weren't telling you initially. And it just goes better for everybody.
Thank you. Now, thinking a little bit more broadly about your careers as writers and as professionals from Harvard forward, could you each give our audience of 6,000 Harvard undergraduates one piece of advice that you've picked up, maybe in a class, maybe in the work world, that guides you?
There is this problem right now at Harvard and other schools of people being morally sure that they're right, being full of moral certitude, that my side is right and the other side is wrong. I hate that. I just loathe that. And I learned through painful error to try not, I still make that mistake, but I've made a lot of mistakes to learn to not be that way, to be open to what the other side, and not just pretend to listen to them, but to actually listen to them.
You know, my one piece of advice is a common quality of everybody I've written about who's been creative and innovative, which is curiosity. And whether it's Benjamin Franklin as a 17-year-old trying to figure out why there were swirls of air and the Gulf Stream swirled when he went to England and he measured the temperature and he charts the Gulf Stream. When I finally get to Leonardo da Vinci, he's doing the same thing. He's putting rocks in the river and saying, why does the water swirl? And then he's doing curls. He's trying to figure out Fibonacci's equation so he can understand the math of it. He paints it in the Mona Lisa, of course. And all of us, when we're very young, tend to be curious. You can walk down Royal Street here and you listen to some kid saying, you know, why is that sign blinking? Or why is that thing hanging out of the window? And finally, the parent does what all parents do and they say, shut up and quit asking so many stupid questions. But I think at a certain point, we got to regain our wonder years and just, I was sitting on this balcony when I was finishing the book that I'm now just turned in, which is on biology. It's on the secrets of life. It's on editing our own genes. And I remember watching a lizard go across, you know, right here on the wrought iron into these leaves and changing colors. And I remember as a kid being curious about that. And then I remember spending the next 40 or 50 years not even noticing that. And so I spent some time with the subject of my book, Jennifer Doudna, who's a biologist at Berkeley, you know, figuring out what do molecules do and how do they make things happen in living things, like changing a skin color. And whether it was Steve Jobs, Einstein, Ben Franklin, they have in their notebooks things like, why is the sky blue? Now, behind me, you have a pretty blue sky, but we forget to be curious about those things. And to me, once you're curious about everything, you start seeing patterns across nature that make you creative.
So one final question for each of you, and this is out of curiosity for sort of how you've approached writing, and you've written about interesting people from you know, John Paul Jones to Steve Jobs. What do you think is what differentiates the way that you write biographies from the way that many other people do, if you sort of had to pick it apart?
There is something truly wonderful about a narrative that is chronological. You know, it's the way the Bible, it has a great lead sentence, in the beginning, comma, you know, and you know that you're going to get stories that go chronologically. When you do something chronologically like a biography, you figure out how a person grows and how their knowledge accumulates and how their wisdom eventually emerges. But if you don't do everything chronologically, you're not really going to capture the essence of life.
I read novels to see how novelists tell stories. I can't do it myself, but I'm still influenced by it, because one thing that really interests me is human ambivalence, that things are not cut and dry, that people rarely think things are. Yeah, I mean, there are zealots, you know, Curtis LeMay had no problem firebombing Tokyo. There are certain people who believe that life is black and white, but most leaders, most people, but certainly most leaders in difficult situations are ambivalent. They're not sure. They're operating on imperfect information. They're trying to deal with their own biases. They're tired, you know. They don't know. And ambivalence is a very difficult thing to capture. Novelists capture it very well. Conflicted feelings.
The other thing that novelists can do, and the type of novels that I love to read, are journeys. I mean, it's one of the grand old themes, which is a person goes on a journey, and it becomes a journey of discovery. Whether it's the Odyssey or Huck Finn or On the Road or anything else, the person going on a journey is one of the great novel themes. And for me, all journeys are a journey of discovery. So I then try to make my books journeys of discovery, not about conflict, not about, you know, weird power trips, about people discovering until they finally understand themselves.